Good afternoon and welcome to the IAS members meeting. My name's Sharon Lewin. I'm President of the International AIDS Society and the International Co-Chair for IAS 2023. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting, the Jagera and Turrbal people, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and also welcome any Indigenous people who are here with us today. The members' meeting is a really important part of being a member of the IAS. We are a membership organisation, and what we do is representing the interests of our members, and this is an opportunity to hear directly from our membership. We have a number of formal activities that will happen as part of the annual members meeting, but as has become the tradition of recent years, we also invite one of our members who is doing outstanding research of high interest to our members to give a presentation, and we're delighted that Dr. Rina Rajasuriya from Malaysia will be giving that presentation on ageing and HIV later in the members meeting. So let's get started with the administrative components of our meeting, and I'm delighted to invite our Executive Director, Birgit Poniatowski, to give us an overview from the IAS Secretariat. So over to you, Birgit.
Thank you, Sharon. Apologies, trying to get the slides up.
It's not a touch screen, just use the mouse.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Sharon. I'm Birgit Poniatowski, the Executive Director of the IAS, and I will give you a brief overview of what we've been up to over the past years. So, firstly, let me start with a reminder of who we are. At the IAS, we convene, we advocate, we educate to promote science, to support action, and to empower people. And people, that's obviously you, our members, and everybody else out there impacted by the HIV epidemic. Now, as you all know, an important platform for our convening activities are the conferences. Last year, we were back in person for the first time after the pandemic in Montreal, if you remember, and with a rather higher turnout on site than we had expected. Now we find us here in Brisbane for the IAS Science Conference. It's only day 2 of the conference. We had a beautiful opening yesterday. You'll see here the lineup of our keynote speakers. And at the bottom right, you see the IAS booth, which looks very empty here because the photo was taken right after build-up. It is no longer as empty, and I really do hope that you will stop by the booth in the exhibition area. Just to check it out and chat with the colleagues, but also for the regional networking meetings that we are organizing at the IAS booth. So after Brisbane, on the conference side, what's going to happen? You may have seen the big announcement we made earlier this year, that in future we will very intentionally rotate our conferences across the various world regions. So for AIDS 2024 next year, we will be in Munich in Germany. Later in the year, in October, for the HIV Research for Prevention Conference, we will be in Lima, Peru. And then the next science conference will take place in Africa. The exact location we will be announcing at the end of this year or early next year. And then for the AIDS conference in 2026, we will all meet in Latin America. Again, the exact location to be announced in the coming months. But we don't just organize conferences, as you may know. One important means for us to express the positions of the IAS, of you, our members, our governing council, is by issuing statements. And we had quite a few things to say over the past year. So we spoke out on PrEP in the MENA region. on the Mosaico trial that was halted earlier this year, but also on the anti-gay legislation in Uganda, on gender-affirming care, on the fact that we want Europe to invest more into HIV vaccine and cure research, but also in support of PEPFAR, who, as I'm sure you know, is the greatest bilateral funder of HIV programs in different parts of the world. Now, in addition to organizing conferences and issuing statements, we convene, advocate, and educate in a number of thematic areas that your governing council has identified as in particular need of action and as areas where the IAS, by who we are and the way we operate, can make a difference. Some of these programs intend to accelerate science, and this particularly in the areas of pediatric HIV, of HIV vaccine science, and the quest for an HIV cure. Another group of programs that we have supports policymakers and healthcare providers to improve services for better outcomes. There's our differentiated service delivery initiative, our person-centered care program, our stigma program. Newly, we are just starting a program on community-led monitoring as well. We're working with young people in the Youth Hub program, and we have the Mark Wainberg Fellowship Program, which provides clinical training to improve person-centered care. And finally, we work to make sure that the latest HIV knowledge is available to a wide audience beyond the participants in our conferences. And to do so, we have the IAS Educational Fund that organizes meetings in different parts of the world, building on the latest science that came out of our conferences, but not just, the latest science that is out there, and contextualizes that for the specific location where we are. And these meetings are organized in many different languages to cater for our audiences in different regions. And then, of course, there's the Journal of the International AIDS Society, an open access journal, which I'm happy to say is maintaining a high impact factor at 6.0, which makes us number 2 of HIV-specific journals, and the only one ahead of us is the Lancet HIV. The journal launched 2 supplements here at the conference, one on person-centered care and another one on long-acting technology. So please make sure to have a look. And also, when you have science that you want to get out there, please do consider the journal for your publication. I'm not going to go through everything that happened last year. We have summarized that in our annual report that is available online, and then I encourage you to have a look. Something else I wanted to talk to you about today here is what we call IAS Plus. This is going to be a new space, a new platform on our website that will bring all the digital content we have together for easier access than you have today. These are webinar recordings, our publications, the knowledge toolkits that we produce after the conferences, a whole large variety of digital resources that you will be able to search by keyword, by language, by region. There are a whole lot of categories that make the information much more easily accessible than it is today. We are launching this platform at the end of September, but there will be demonstrations at the IAS booth, and you see I'm trying to get you to visit the IAS booth. There will be demonstrations today at 2:30 and tomorrow at 1 o'clock and on Wednesday at 12:30. So if you have a moment, please make sure to stop by and have a closer look at the platform. I'm sure you'll like it. Now, an update on who we all are and who you all are. We are almost 16,000 members currently, the world over. The largest share in Africa, followed by North America, the Asia and Pacific region, Europe and Latin America. And that's a lot of people. I've put the numbers for the different regions here for you as well. Now, importantly, you as members will get to elect some new governing council members next year. So as you know, your representatives on the governing council are elected for 4-year terms and can stay for a second term. And next year we will have a number of seats that will be up for re-election, but also to be filled by new representatives. At the end of November, you will all receive a communication from us explaining the process, what happens when, etc. Then in January, February, nominations open, and every member can either nominate themselves or somebody else to stand for election in their region. Voting will then take place in March and April, and by the end of May, we will know who the new governing council members are. And with that, I thank you very much. And I'm now very happy to introduce to you Jen Cates, who will be presenting the finances of the International AIDS Society. Jen Cates is the Senior Vice President and Director of Global Health and HIV Policy at Kaiser Family Foundation, where she oversees policy analysis and research focused on the US government's role in global health and on the global and domestic HIV epidemics. Jen has been a member of the Governing Council since 2018, and she's been our treasurer since July 2020. Jen, over to you.
Hello, everyone. It's very good to be here and to do something that's quite important as part of our responsibility as members and to you as a governing council and officers of the IAS. I get to present to you the financial report. As part of this today, we're going to be asking for your approval of 2 things. One is the consolidated financial statements of the organization, and the other is the appointment of our auditor. Before I continue, though, I just want to say normally we would have our auditor with us, but because it's 4 a.m. in Geneva, they're not going to be with us. I hope that's okay with everybody. If there are questions, our Emmanuel Flamand is here from the IAS who can answer questions, and myself. And also, what I'm going to be presenting today is really the top line information. You can get much more detail online. All of our information is available to the full membership. Okay. So very briefly to start, this is the overview picture for our 2022 year. The consolidated financial statements show that there's a $2.97 million surplus. Most of that is from the conference itself, as you can see here, 2.344. The detail is here. As it shows here, the income total is 26 million, and that is more than last year. So those of you who've been part of the IAS know, this is because of the big conference that we have every other year. This is always the pattern that we see. And also, you can compare this to 2020, and as we heard before, and as everyone knows, 2020 was virtual only because of the pandemic, and 2022 was our first return to in-person with a hybrid conference that was quite successful. So you can see that reflected here. Membership fees in particular increased, so that was a big increase over that 2-year period. Then just so you have it, the income that we do have is primarily from governments and the public sector. That's 6 million. That's mostly the Canadian Public Health Agency, so that was our 2022 conference, as we heard, was in Montreal, and from the US National Institutes of Health. We also receive, and thanks to all of our donors, grants from foundations, which was about 2.6 million, primarily the Gates Foundation, and then corporate grants and sponsorships of about 5.5 million, and it's mostly from ViV Healthcare. Our expenditure, as you see here, is 23 million, 14 million for the conference, AIDS 2022, and we also have funding for our future conferences, this one right now, and then for programs and secretariat expenses. All in all, that gives us this operating result, the surplus of 3 million. There's a slight negative financial result here. Just for those of you who focus on this, this is due to exchange rate fluctuations as well as investment in the market. As we all know, it's been a bumpy road there. This gives you some high-level detail on the programs, where you can see the biggest programs here. This is, again, for the income of 6.1 million. We have a small deficit that is really due to a few planned things. One is the Journal of the International AIDS Society, some other expenses and timing there. We made a donation as an organization to the Ukraine, and we also had the COVID HIV initiative. So these things were planned by the IAS as expenses that we were going to have. The main program, as you see here, is the Educational Fund, followed by Differentiated Service Delivery and Stigma. And the result that we end up with is a very balanced one, as you can see here. Let's look at our balance sheet. Our assets, which are at the bottom, are 31 million, and that is more than last year. This is mainly in cash. Our liabilities also increased, mostly due to deferred income. And our restricted funds are the scholarship reserve, as you see here, the 839. That increase is thanks to delegates of conferences. When you register for a conference, you are given the option to tick scholarship fund to help others who might need assistance. So that is, members are doing that, and that is increased. And for future conferences, we have spent 622,000. I wanted to just highlight here this other designated funds. Currently, the way that our structure, the way we are structured is we have these designated funds that go to specific, or revolving funds that go to specific areas. We have an AIDS conference revolving fund, and that is at 10 million now, thanks to the surplus that I showed you earlier. We also have the IAS conference revolving fund, the HIV R4P revolving fund, and institutional memory revolving fund. But essentially, these together are what allow the IAS to, in different years, support a conference that might need extra support, and it kind of balances out. Going to our income, statements of income and expenditures, as you see here. Hold on, let me make sure I'm getting caught up here. Yep. Total income 18.7, total expenditures 16.39, which gives us our final result here of 2.3. The surplus, when this happens, the surplus gets allocated to these revolving funds. We had a total, and this is a good story, we had a total of almost 8,000 fully paying delegates for the conference. That's 75% in person and 25% virtual, so higher than we expected. And there were more than 13,000 participants overall. And then we're happy to say that our auditors, KPMG, had an unqualified opinion, and there were no significant control deficiencies. They were very positive about our audit. And we, as a finance committee, meet with our auditors every year and discuss this with them, and that was conveyed, and they were very pleased with the performance. So, in conclusion, we are looking to you, our membership, to approve both the 2022 consolidated financial statements, and we'd like to renew this with the same auditor, KPMG, for our auditor in 2023. So we are recommending approval to all of you for this, and I think I just ask for everyone to show their approval this way. Great, I think that we can say that that is most people here, but if there's is there anybody who who does not approve any of these decisions? Terrific. Thank you so much. This is a really important function of the membership, and we really appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Jen. Before I move on to introduce our speaker for this meeting, I did want to just take a moment to thank a number of people that have made the IAS such a great organisation, and as you can see, in very solid financial shape. So you come to a meeting once a year, I hope, this science meeting and the international meeting on alternate years. You might participate in some of the educational programs, you might participate in some of our training programs, but throughout the year we have the IAS Secretariat that are making the IAS a great organisation. You've heard from our leader, Birgit, but also a whole range of staff that work tirelessly throughout the year to make the IAS a great place. Many of the executive leadership are sitting up here in the front row, so I'd like you just to applaud the IAS Secretariat for the great work that they do. And as I said earlier, we're a member-based organisation. The place works because you nominate members from your own regions and form a governing council. And we have an outstanding governing council at the moment. Representatives from the 5 regions, experts in a whole range of different aspects of the HIV response. We have community members, we have academia, we have people that are in non-government organisations. They too give a lot of time and effort, not only at our 6 monthly meetings, but also participation in a whole range of the different programs we operate. They bring amazing amount of passion and enthusiasm, and I think I can also reassure each of you that each of your elected members is bringing to the organisation the issues that are relevant for you in your region. HIV is such a diverse infection, and it infects different parts of the world very differently. So we hear from your elected members regularly on the Governing Council. So I also wanted to thank the Governing Council. They're sitting also up at the front in the first few rows. So thank you to my Governing Council members. And then a number of people take on the extra burden of additional roles within the Governing Council, and they're members of the executive. But special thanks to Jen, who has been on the Finance Committee for a number of years and also done an outstanding job. Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Reena Rajasuriya. Reena is an Associate Professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Malaya and also an Adjunct Research Fellow at the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity at the University of Melbourne, and I'm the Director of the Doherty Institute. I have a conflict of interest to declare in that Reena was my PhD student many years ago when I was at Monash University. Reena is a pharmacist. It's very unusual for pharmacists to go on to do PhDs. She came highly recommended to me from her friend and mentor, Adiba Kamarulzaman, who's also in the audience. So how could I ever say no to Adiba? But what of course transpired was that who Adiba had recommended to me was one of the most outstanding PhD students I've ever supervised. Reena did a magnificent job in learning immunology, basic immunology. She's fantastic skill in statistics and analysing data, and is really driven by her passion to answer important questions. But what has made me incredibly proud of Reena is what she's done since returning to Malaysia, a very, very different setting to be doing research, and particularly laboratory-based research. And since returning to Malaysia, Reena's interests, of course, have developed, and she runs her own independent research program, taking some of the immunology she learnt on immune reconstitution many, many years ago to understanding the immunopathogenesis of ageing. And we're just delighted to hear from Reena, an outstanding clinician researcher on ageing with HIV, prioritising person-centred care. Welcome, Reena.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you for that really kind introduction. You've really set the bar very high now. Thank you to the IAS for the invitation to speak, and thank you for featuring this really important topic on HIV and aging, and one that I think we have still a lot of work to do, not just in the region that I am in the Asia Pacific, but worldwide. And I hope I will highlight some of the priorities in my talk in the next 30 minutes or so. But first, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land which we meet today. And I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I have no conflicts of interest to declare. So this is the outline of my talk, and I'll start by sharing with you the global epidemiology of older people living with HIV and what we might expect in the next decade. I'll then share with you some emerging data on health outcomes in individuals growing older with and without HIV. And reflecting on some of the key findings from this study, I'll review the current gaps in our HIV care programs and highlight areas which I think that we still need to work on in order to build better models of person-centered care. So among the 39 million people living with HIV globally, 1 in 5 women and 1 in 4 men are over the age of 50, and they make up about 24% of the total global population of people living with HIV. Now, some of you might think these numbers are small and still manageable. What is quite worrying is the fast increasing numbers of older people with HIV. Now, this section of the population pyramid in the widest segment represents individuals in their 40s, and in the next decade will age across the threshold of 50 years. And they alone make up 26% of the global population of people living with HIV. So we have a large number of the population who are aging. Now the numbers or the burden of older people living with HIV is also disproportionately distributed. We have close to 50% of them residing in East and South Africa, and the largest numbers are in countries and regions with low or middle income economies, and this sort of highlights the impending burden on the health system in the years to come. Now, in this study that was published now almost 10 years ago in the age HIV cohort, what was described by the group was that individuals living with HIV, or people living with HIV, had a higher frequency of chronic comorbidities, almost 5 to 10 years earlier compared to people without HIV. Now, in recent years, the same group have updated their study and highlighted and essentially looked at what was the trajectory of health outcomes in the same group of individuals when they followed them up for a period of 6 years. Now, in this analysis, what they found was that although people living with HIV started off with a higher frequency of chronic comorbidities compared to individuals without HIV, the rate at which new comorbidities occurred over the period of 6 years was similar in the two groups. However, with each additional comorbidity, this was associated with an increased risk of death, increased risk of over 3 times for each additional comorbidity. Now, the impact of HIV on long-term health outcomes is perhaps more obvious in this analysis, where they investigated disabilities associated with chronic comorbidities. Now, this was measured using a health matrix called Disability Adjusted Life Years, or DALY, and this takes into account the number of years lost due to disabilities associated with having a chronic comorbidity or due to premature death. And as you can see in the graph, there was people living with HIV experienced significantly higher increases in healthy years of life lost compared to individuals without HIV as they grew older. And this was largely attributed to deaths due to non-AIDS defining cancers and NCDs. What they also found was that individuals who experienced the greatest increase in healthy life years lost were people living with HIV who had a prior history of late care presentation, who had a prior history of AIDS, and who had a prior exposure of NRTIs, toxic NRTIs. And this has got significant global implications because this profile essentially describes the vast majority of people living with HIV in resource-limited settings today. So there were a number of key points from this study which stood out to me. And the first was the increased mortality of non-AIDS cancers and NCDs, and these are essentially health conditions which are preventable. The second was people living with HIV experience a higher degree of disability, and compared to individuals without HIV, despite experiencing the same numbers or same increase in chronic comorbidities. And this largely speaks to what we often hear or what we often read of poor quality of life in people living with HIV, despite them having suppressed viral loads. And the last was the HIV legacy effects and its impact on long-term outcomes in people living with HIV. And some of these legacy effects, like late presentation to care, are still persistent issues today. So can we do better? Reflecting on some of the findings from this study, it gives us an opportunity to relook at the gaps in our current practices and rethink how we might optimize and personalize care across the life course of people living with HIV. And I have grouped this into three main priority areas. The first is optimizing prevention and screening for NCDs and malignancies. In this table, it represents the cardiovascular risk profile of participants from the EuroCEDA cohort. Now, the EuroCEDA cohort is a cohort of over 100 clinics in HIV clinics across 34 countries in Europe, Argentina, and Israel. And what you see is a high frequency of various modifiable cardiovascular risk factors. 1 in 5 individuals in this study also had a moderate to high Framingham risk. Now, what the investigators did was they prospectively followed up the participants' data to assess the proportion of individuals who successfully modified their cardiovascular risk factors while in clinical care. And this was what they found after over 7,666 person-years of follow-up, despite 80% of participants achieving viral suppression, modifications of cardiovascular risk factors were still poor across the board. Now, there are also gaps in screening for malignancies. Now, this study was done in the DC cohort, and investigators assessed both incidence of cancers as well as screening practices in close to 8,000 individuals in the DC cohort, which is a cohort of people living with HIV in clinical care. And individuals at risk of cancer were defined as those who didn't have a prior history of cancer, and screening eligibility was assessed based on published guidelines. And as you can see, highlighted in the pink bar, there were significant shortfalls in screening practices across all of the cancers assessed, and less than 60% of eligible participants were screened overall. So the findings from this study and the previous study on NCDs highlight that we have a lot of work to do in terms of optimizing our screening practices, especially as the demographics of our patients in clinic grow older. Now, another interesting finding from this study was that the investigators found that 41% of incident breast cancer occurred at ages earlier than the recommended age for screening. 17% for colorectal cancer and 8% for lung cancer. And this raises an increasingly debated question on whether or not we should have tailored guidelines for NCDs and malignancies for people living with HIV. if you review the literature, there are a number of limitations to the utility of guidelines for NCDs and cancers which have been raised, and I've summarized some of them here. Many of the guidelines that we use today to manage and screen people living with HIV are adapted from guidelines intended for the general population, and so they don't, or they have poor considerations of unique risks for risks which are unique for people living with HIV. For example, the extent and duration of immunodeficiency, chronic immunoactivation, exposure to toxic antiretrovirals, co-infection with oncogenic viruses, as well as perhaps a high and longer exposure for smoking and alcohol use. Many of our clinical trials also do not include people living with HIV as part of their patient pool in trials, and so there's limited evidence to refine treatment algorithms, and this limitation has largely been raised in the literature related to treatment for non-AIDS defining cancers. Many of our guidelines are also age-specific, and we know that for some conditions and some cancers, the cancers can occur early in people living with HIV, and this may not align with the risks in the population. However, because many health schemes reimburse subsidized screening based on published guidelines for the general population, this in turn impacts access to free screening or earlier screening for people living with HIV, and this becomes a barrier. And finally, there are a number of cancers which are not very common in the general population, particularly lung and anal cancer, despite the burden of these cancers being high in people living with HIV. And so we don't have good guidance on screening. Lung cancer, for example, is expected to be the highest cancer in people living with HIV in the US by 2030. So we do need a lot more evidence, and we need to build the evidence base in order to guide enhanced screening practices and early intervention for NCDs as well as malignancies. The second point I would like to raise is the value of assessing functional outcomes for diseases in people living with HIV. And let me use a hypothetical example to try to explain this. Now, in a lot of our HIV programs, the focus of care is largely on clinical disease and health conditions. Now, the example here is Mr. A, who's 66 years old. He has an undetectable virus, but he has low vision due to cataract. Now, when he goes into the clinic, his consultation is largely going to be focused on the fact that he's got good HIV disease control, and he probably will get a referral to see an ophthalmologist. But does this address all of Mr. A's health concerns? If we probed a little bit further, we might realize that Mr. A actually has a low mood. He is frustrated that he can't read and follow the news anymore because his vision is poor. He's having difficulties preparing meals because he can't read food instructions, and he's lost confidence in driving. And because he can't drive anymore, he no longer makes his weekly visit to the community library, where he usually volunteers and where he mingles with other members in the community. Now, Mr. A lives alone. He doesn't have family support, and this is the reason why he has been delaying his cataract operation, because he doesn't know how he's going to manage after the operation because he lives alone. So, though this is a hypothetical example, it's very relatable, and it essentially highlights that when we focus solely on the health condition without assessing the functional impact in individuals, we lose or we miss opportunities to identify disabilities and vulnerabilities, and this needs to change. As people living with HIV grow older, we need to think about how to expand our HIV treatment programs so that it includes assessments for functional outcomes as well as needs, and this needs to be integrated as part of routine care. There is a one example of a framework that allows us to do this is the Integrated Care for Older People, or ICOP. And this is a framework that was introduced by WHO in 2017 under the model of healthy aging. This framework proposes that we monitor an individual for their functional ability or functional capacity, and this can be done routinely in clinic. Now, in this context, an individual's functional capacity is referred to as their intrinsic capacity, and it can be operationalized by measuring mobility, vitality or energy balance, their sensory, hearing and vision, their psychological health and cognition. And all of these domains can be assessed using existing tools, and in studies has also been done in the community setting. In the last 3 to 5 years, there have been a large number of studies which have validated intrinsic capacity in the general older population, and it's been found to be a good tool to identify and predict frailty, disability, as well as mortality. But the utility of this tool in the context of people living with HIV is still poorly understood. We did a small study in UMMC where we recruited 155 participants who were returning to our clinic as part of routine care, and 89 controls from community volunteers. The median age in both groups were 50 years, and people living with HIV had a median duration of 13 years. We assessed the domains of intrinsic capacity using validated tools. And as you can see in this graph here, the frequency, showing the frequency of deficits in each of the domains. There were really not much difference between people living with HIV and controls, except for cognition. However, when we looked at the cumulative occurrence of deficits, there were twice as many people living with HIV with deficits compared to controls. When we assessed the number of intrinsic capacity domains with deficits and the ability to perform instrumental activities of daily living, we found that individuals with a higher number of domain deficits was positively or was significantly correlated with difficulties in performing IADL, and this was both in people living with HIV and controls. We also assessed the correlation of intrinsic capacity to other health outcomes and compared this to VAX index, which is another composite tool, but this tool uses parameters which are more clinical based rather than intrinsic capacity, which uses domains which are functional based. And we see that it correlates, intrinsic capacity tends to correlate better with outcomes of quality of life and social participation and loneliness. The intrinsic capacity tool also performed quite well in identifying individuals with frailty when this was measured using the frailty phenotype. So although this study was small and needs to be replicated in a larger, more diverse setting of people living with HIV, what it demonstrates is that there is a utility of using tools which are functional based, and it allows us to identify individuals based on their vulnerabilities. And this potentially can be used in clinic and to complement disease-based monitoring, which a lot of us use as an approach for HIV management. The last point I wanted to raise was on addressing stigma across the HIV and NCD care continuum. There are a number of studies now which have shown that HIV legacy effects, and these includes exposure to toxic antiretrovirals, late presentation to care, AIDS-defining illness, inverse CD4-CD8 ratio, and having longer durations of detectable viremia are all associated with more adverse outcomes in people living with HIV. Now, today we have reconciled some of this, for example, with better and safer antiretrovirals, more efficacious antiretrovirals, but not all of this have been addressed. Delayed presentation to care, for example, still remains a substantial global problem. In this study, in the IDEA regions globally, which looked at CD4 counts at presentation. And you see in all regions, with the exception of North America, more than 50% of individuals newly diagnosed with HIV are late presenters. And this was often worse when in low middle income setting and when HIV was diagnosed at an older age. There are a number of factors which contribute to late presentation to care, and I've listed some of them here. But stigma and its intersection with marginalized identities are perhaps one of the hardest to dismantle. Stigma can also affect the NCD care continuum, and in this study done in Kenya, where they used a mixed method approach to study the impact of stigma in individuals newly diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma, which is a cancer which has got quite debilitating skin and very visible skin lesions. What they found was that in the stories that were, or in the lived experiences that were raised and were analyzed among the transcripts of participants, intersectional stigma was a significant dominant factor, and HIV-related stigma particularly was raised in a lot of the stories that were shared. This was followed by cancer-related stigma and, to a lesser extent, skin-related stigma. When they looked at the overall stigma score, this was highest at the point of diagnosis, but this declined with continued engagement in care, and participants related how the high stigma that they felt was contributed to them delaying treatment, attending treatment for their Kaposi sarcoma. And similar reports have also been reported with cervical cancer and for depression. What this shows is that there are unwanted effects. The unwanted effects of stigma has got significant impact on both the NCD care cascade as well as the HIV care cascade. And in order to for people living with HIV to age well, we need to address both. So in summary, the highest burden of older people living with HIV are in low middle income settings, and this is growing, these numbers are growing very fast. To build better models of person-centered care, we need a larger evidence base to guide tailored guidelines for NCDs and malignancies, and we need better strategies to optimize prevention and screening practices. We need to integrate functional assessments as part of routine HIV care, and we need to reduce stigma across both the HIV and the NCD care cascade so people living with HIV can age well and with dignity. I'd like to acknowledge my team as well as collaborators that I've worked with, and I'm very grateful to individuals who've contributed data and given me feedback for these slides. Thank you.
For a outstanding talk. We have time for a few questions if people would like to ask any questions. You can, I don't think I can see any microphones, but if you just stand up and speak loudly, tell us your name and where you're from, and tell us a question before you go ahead. We also have 32 people online, so I'm sorry I didn't welcome our online participants. And people online should also feel free to pop in some questions, which I can easily access here at the front of the auditorium. But yes, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really helpful. I was recently asked to present at the Australasian and New Zealand.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just noticed there's a microphone up the back, so maybe if you just pop up to there, that'd be great, because then our online participants can hear as well. Apologies for that.
That's okay. Better? Yeah, hi, Fabiola Martin from Brisbane. Thank you so much for this very eloquent and comprehensive presentation. I was recently asked to present at the Australasian and New Zealand geriatric conference here in the very same room that met for the first time after COVID hit our region. And what I noticed was missing in those presentations around frailty and aging in the general population was sexual function. So I think one of the things that I would like to kind of open up for discussion or put to you and our team here is sexual function for people who age is also really important, and often a motivator to actually do the screenings that we need to do and address cardiovascular risks. So I think it's a nice bait to maintain sexual function and have a fulfilling, happy sexual life at an old age.
Hear me? Yes, okay. Thank you very much. I think that's a really good point. The ICOP model that I presented is an opening, can you say, maybe a screening tool for you to start conversations. Because it focuses on function, it allows a clinician to start conversations with their patients on what's important for them. And although the focus is just on 5 domains, you're absolutely right that that doesn't mean that it needs to stop there. But I think the point that I was trying to make is that we often focus on the clinical disease, but we don't address the functional implications of those disease, and we need to move towards that in our consultations.
I'd like you to join me in thanking Rena for a fabulous talk, and I'll just move over here to do the final part of our meeting, and that is to tell you about the Mark Weinberg Fellowship Program and introduce you to our fellowship recipients. So the Mark Weinberg Fellowship Program is an initiative of the IAS Educational Fund, and it's aimed at strengthening access to high-quality HIV service delivery with a person-centred approach in Central, Eastern, Southern and Western Africa, and more recently in the Asia and Pacific. And what the fellowship program does is provide 2-year fellowships to clinicians to become HIV specialists. In Africa, the program is supported by ViiV Healthcare, and it places fellows in clinical institutions in Africa and Europe for a year, respectively, while in Asia, the program, which is new, is supported by Gilead, and fellows will spend 1 year at a clinical institution and 1 year completing a mentored research project. Now, during the programs, fellows get expert training as well as one-to-one mentorship to build capacity, foster clinical research, and develop long-term sustainable partnerships. And I'm sure everyone will agree and can remember their own key mentors in their careers, which have played a very significant role over sometimes decades. So earlier this year, we were fortunate to be able to recruit 3 additional fellows from Africa and the first fellows from Asia Pacific to the program, and they'll spend 2 years in HIV specialised centres and have an amazing opportunity culminating in a postgraduate diploma in HIV. So the newly selected fellows for Africa are Antoinette Ama Della Wardi from Ghana, Razima Rashid, I'll get you to clap at the very end, Razima Rashid Vali Kamisa from Mozambique, and Wadatu Dine Mutrada from Cote d'Ivoire. And the fellows from Asia Pacific are Jack Rapatara Banarungang from Thailand, Maria Leilis Palmaris from the Philippines, and Yusuf Olia Rahman from Indonesia. We're delighted to have them all here today, and so please come and join me on the stage, the Mark Weinberg Fellows. I have certificates for you, and I'll quickly give them out, perhaps, so we can take a nice photo. Antoinette? Yes. Razima? Thank you so much. Wadatu? Jakapatara? Maria. And Yusuf. Great. Please go into the middle of the stage so we can all see you. Excellent. Thank you so much. We hope we'll be seeing you back as Governing Council members. The President, Treasurer, President-elect will be looking out for you in the next 5 to 10 years. And just before I ask the recipients to return to their seats, I wanted to acknowledge a number of people. A special thanks to the award committees. These were chaired by Kenneth Ngure and Adiba Kamarul-Zaman, members of the executive of the IAS Governing Council. Both Kenneth and Adiba put in an enormous amount of time in ensuring we had a great progress and selected the very best fellows for this important program. So thanks to Kenneth and Adiba. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our Members Committee meeting. Please join us for a networking event outside the auditorium. We have food, we have drinks. I assume they're non-alcoholic, I'm not sure. But we have food, and it's Australia after all. We do like to drink. But there'll be food and drinks. And make sure you find your Governing Council members from your region. Talk to them about the issues that are important to you. We want to hear about it. And enjoy the rest of the meeting. Thanks very much.